The night has always been a faithful companion to those who work behind the wheel. For taxi drivers in Mexico, the hours after sundown are not only when the streets grow quieter, but also when the strange, the unsettling, and the unexplainable begin to crawl out of the shadows. There's something about the night that bends reality, something that makes ordinary roads transform into corridors of fear. These stories aren't made-up fairy tales or urban myths created to scare children. They come from the mouths of real taxi drivers who swear that what they experienced is etched into their memory forever. Men who spend their nights crossing cities, picking up strangers, and trusting fate with every passenger that steps into the back seat. These are men who know the streets better than anyone, and yet, on certain nights, they come face to face with something no human map or GPS could ever prepare them for. Tonight, I will take you with me into their world, into the backseat of their cars, into the winding avenues where the veil between the living and the dead seems to be at its thinnest. The first story comes from a driver named Ernesto. He had been driving taxis for nearly 20 years in Mexico City. His work schedule was simple, evenings until late night, the kind of hours most people would avoid. But Ernesto loved the city at night. Less traffic, fewer distractions, and most of the time passengers who just wanted to get home. But one night, his love for the city turned into a nightmare that still makes his voice tremble when he recalls it. It was around 2 a.m. when Ernesto was waiting near a dimly lit avenue not far from a cemetery. He wasn't superstitious. Cemeteries didn't scare him. In fact, he thought it was funny how many of his colleagues would avoid those areas. But that night, when he saw a woman in a long white dress waving at him, something inside him stirred with unease. Still, business was business. He stopped, rolled down the passenger window, and asked where she was headed. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, and she gave him an address about 20 minutes away. Ernesto nodded, unlocked the back door, and she slid in. From the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim streetlights. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders, covering most of her face. She didn't speak after giving the address, and the silence inside the car grew heavy. Ernesto tried to lighten the mood, as he always did with quiet passengers. "It's a little late to be out alone, Senora. Were you visiting someone?" She didn't reply. Instead, she leaned her head against the window and remained still. He thought maybe she was too tired or simply didn't want to talk. The drive felt unusually long, as if the streets stretched further than they should have. Ernesto began to notice how cold the air inside the taxi felt, despite the warm summer night outside. He adjusted the AC, but the chill didn't go away. In fact, he started to see his own breath forming small clouds as he exhaled. His chest tightened, but he kept driving. When he finally reached the address, he turned around to let her know they had arrived. The back seat was empty. Panic shot through his body. He slammed on the brakes and jumped out, opening the rear door, expecting maybe she had crouched down or fainted. Nothing. The seatbelt was still buckled, untouched. His hands shook as he stood there in the silence of the street. A moment later, a man from a nearby house came out, drawn by the sudden screech of Ernesto's brakes. Ernesto, pale and sweating, explained that a woman had given him this address. The man listened carefully, then shook his head. "Senor, no one has lived here for years. The last family moved away after their daughter died. She was hit by a car not far from the cemetery." Ernesto felt his knees weaken. He got back in his taxi, turned the ignition, and drove away without looking back. He says he still avoids that area to this day, and every time he catches sight of a woman in white by the roadside, his stomach drops in fear. But Ernesto isn't alone. Another driver, named Javier, shared a night that almost drove him out of the job completely. Unlike Ernesto, Javier drove in Guadalajara, where the city seems to breathe with both ancient traditions and modern chaos. His route was usually around bars and clubs, especially on weekends, when business was best. But one particular Friday night, something happened that no amount of tequila in his passenger's veins could explain away. It was close to 3 a.m. when a group of young men hailed him outside a bar. Their laughter echoed in the empty street, their bodies stumbling as they shoved each other playfully. They piled into the taxi, shouting out their address. Javier started driving, annoyed but used to the noise. Yet after a few minutes, something strange happened. The rowdy chatter began to fade, until the car was completely silent. He looked into the rearview mirror, expecting to see them passed out. Instead, his heart nearly stopped. The back seat was empty. Javier swerved, nearly crashing into the sidewalk, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. He pulled over, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it. He had just seen them, heard them, even smelled the alcohol on their breath. They couldn't have disappeared. Trembling, he got out of the car, checked the back seat with his own eyes. Nothing. Not even the faintest trace that anyone had been there. Confused and terrified, he decided to head home early. But as he drove through a deserted road, his headlights caught something that made him slam the brakes. There they were, the same group of young men standing in the middle of the street. Their faces pale, their eyes black pits of emptiness. They didn't move as the headlights washed over them. They just stood, staring at him. Javier felt his stomach twist, his hands shaking violently as he shifted the car into reverse. He backed away as fast as he could, heart hammering in his chest, until the figures disappeared into the darkness. That was the last night he ever worked past midnight. Some say these are hallucinations born from exhaustion. Others believe these drivers encountered restless spirits that roam the night. Whatever the explanation, there's something undeniably chilling about the consistency of these tales. Taxi drivers, men hardened by years of street work, men who don't scare easily, recalling moments that leave them pale and trembling. And then there's Ricardo's story. Ricardo wasn't just any driver. He prided himself on being the one who would take routes others refused. Dangerous neighborhoods, empty highways, or roads lined with abandoned houses, he drove them all. But one night, even his courage wasn't enough. Ricardo had picked up a passenger near the outskirts of town. It was a man this time, tall, wearing an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see decades ago, not in the present day. The man was polite, his voice calm, almost soothing. He gave Ricardo an address that was far, a lonely stretch near an old ranch road. Ricardo hesitated for a moment, but the man's calm demeanor convinced him to go. The ride began normally, but soon, Ricardo realized he couldn't hear the usual sounds of the city anymore. No barking dogs, no distant music, no cars passing by. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. He tried to speak, to break the tension. "Heading home late, sir?" The man only smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. When they reached the destination, Ricardo pulled over. "Here we are," he said, turning slightly to face the passenger. But the seat was empty. His chest tightened as he realized he had driven nearly 30 minutes with no one behind him. The road around him was deserted, no houses, no lights, nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. His hands trembled as he turned the car around, desperate to get back to the city. Yet as he drove, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The man was there again, seated calmly in the back, his dark eyes locked on Ricardo's. Ricardo froze, his throat dry, unable to breathe. He couldn't scream, couldn't stop. The figure simply sat there, unblinking. Ricardo pressed the gas pedal harder, his only thought to reach a place with light, with people, anywhere but here. When he finally pulled into a gas station, he looked again. The back seat was empty. Ricardo quit driving taxis a week later. He swore that when he looked into the rearview mirror at night, he could still see those dark eyes watching him. These aren't just isolated accounts. They form part of a long chain of whispers and warnings passed down among taxi drivers across Mexico. Stories of passengers who vanish, of figures that reappear miles away, of strange chills and suffocating silences inside the car. Each tale adds another layer to the mystery of the night. Each driver carries not only their passengers, but also the weight of the unknown riding with them. The night holds secrets that only those who wander its streets truly understand. Taxi drivers are among the few who spend their lives crossing through this world of shadows, picking up faces that appear and disappear, voices that whisper and fade. For many, these encounters blur the line between reality and nightmare. Yet every story, every chilling confession, carries a ring of truth too heavy to dismiss. The stories spread from driver to driver, like warnings etched into memory, reminders that the road is not always empty, even when it looks that way. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a driver named Manuel, who had been working in Monterrey for several years. Manuel considered himself skeptical, someone who didn't believe in spirits, ghosts, or curses. But after one night, his skepticism turned into something else, fear he couldn't shake off, no matter how much he tried. Manuel had been parked outside a small bus station just after midnight. His last passenger had gotten off, and he was debating whether to call it a night. That's when he noticed a woman standing near the entrance. She wasn't hailing him, not at first. She stood there, staring at the taxis as if waiting for something. Finally, she approached and asked him in a quiet, almost hesitant tone if he could take her to a nearby colonia. Manuel agreed, unlocking the door. She climbed in, her movements oddly stiff, her head always slightly bowed. The moment they started moving, Manuel noticed something strange. The woman never gave him a precise street number, just the name of the colonia. He asked for more details, but she only repeated the same vague instructions. Keep going straight. Her voice was soft, and it carried a strange echo, like someone speaking from a distance. As they drove deeper into the neighborhood, Manuel realized the streets were completely deserted. Not a single light flickered from the houses. The silence pressed in, suffocating. He glanced at the woman through the rearview mirror. That's when he felt his blood run cold. Her reflection wasn't there. He could see the back seat clearly, but it was empty, even though he could hear her breathing. His chest tightened. He looked back quickly. She was still sitting there, her hair covering her face. He nearly slammed the brakes, but fear locked his body. He kept driving, praying silently. Then, as they reached the last street of the colonia, she whispered, "Stop here." Manuel froze. They were in front of a small abandoned house, windows shattered, roof caving in, walls covered in graffiti. He turned to ask if this was really her stop, but the seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. She had vanished. Terrified, Manuel sped out of the colonia, vowing never to drive in that area again. A few days later, when he told another driver about the encounter, the man nodded solemnly. They say a woman was murdered in that colonia years ago. Her spirit still wanders, looking for a ride back home. Manuel swore he never wanted to hear that story again, but the memory of her faint voice, telling him to drive straight, still makes him shiver. And then there's Luis, a young driver from Puebla, who encountered something far darker than a vanishing passenger. Luis was new to the job, still enthusiastic, still unscarred by the strange tales other drivers swapped during breaks. He thought their ghost stories were exaggerated, just ways to pass the time. But one night, on a road outside the city, he discovered what it meant to meet something not entirely human. He had been driving along the outskirts when he saw a man flagging him down. The man looked desperate, his shirt stained as if he had been running for miles. Without hesitation, Luis stopped and let him in. The man climbed into the back seat, panting heavily, his eyes darting around as if he was being chased. "Please," the man gasped, "just drive. Fast." Luis obeyed, pushing the taxi forward. The man didn't give him an address, only begged him to keep moving. Every few minutes, the passenger would twist around, staring out the rear window as though expecting someone or something to appear. Finally, Luis asked what was happening. The man leaned forward, his voice low, almost a growl. "They're coming." Luis felt a chill run through his body. "Who's coming?" he asked. The man's breathing grew heavier. "You'll see." Moments later, Luis noticed shadows moving along the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a trick of the headlights, but as he drove faster, the shadows kept pace with the car. Figures, tall and thin, running alongside them, their limbs twisting unnaturally. Their faces were obscured, yet he could feel their eyes fixed on him. His passenger let out a terrified cry. "Don't stop no matter what." Luis pressed harder on the accelerator, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. The figures grew closer, their movements jerky, almost animalistic. One of them slammed its hand against the side of the car, leaving a long, dark smear across the glass. Luis screamed, swerving the car wildly, desperate to escape. Then, without warning, the passenger went silent. Luis dared a quick glance into the mirror and froze. The back seat was empty. The man who had begged him to drive, who had warned him of the shadows, was gone. But the figures were still there, running beside the taxi. Luis prayed aloud, tears streaming down his face. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished. The road was empty again, stretching into silence. Luis pulled over, shaking uncontrollably, unable to breathe. The side of the car where the shadow had touched it was smeared with something dark, something that wouldn't wash off, no matter how much he tried later. He quit the job within weeks, convinced that what he had seen was not of this world. Not all stories are about passengers who disappear. Some are about those who linger too long, their presence heavy and unnatural. A driver named Alejandro shared his chilling experience of a passenger who refused to leave. It was a stormy night in Veracruz, the rain pounding so hard it blurred the windshield. Alejandro was ready to end his shift when a man flagged him down. The man's clothes were soaked, clinging to his thin frame. He got into the taxi, dripping water onto the seats, and gave Alejandro an address near the coast. The ride was tense. The man never spoke again, only stared at the raindrops sliding across the window. When they reached the address, Alejandro turned to let him know they had arrived. But the man didn't move. His head was tilted at an odd angle, his eyes wide open but lifeless. Alejandro's heart raced. He reached back, shaking the man's shoulder. His hand went straight through. Cold air, nothing more. Alejandro jumped out of the car, stumbling into the rain, his body trembling. When he looked back into the taxi, the back seat was empty, but the cushion where the man had sat was still soaked with water. He drove away without daring to look in the mirror, the storm swallowing the sound of his racing heartbeat. Stories like these circulate endlessly among taxi drivers across Mexico. They speak of passengers who vanish, figures that chase cars, voices that whisper from the back seat. Some drivers try to laugh them off, calling them tricks of exhaustion or imagination. Others carry them like scars, reminders that the road is never truly empty. The darkness of Mexico's streets hides more than crime or danger. It hides things that defy reason, things that slip into cars and sit quietly, waiting to be noticed. And for every driver who shares his story, there are countless others who remain silent, too shaken to ever speak of what they've seen. There is a certain weight in the silence that lingers inside a taxi after an encounter with the unexplainable. Drivers carry it with them like a shadow, a secret they wish to forget, yet never can. And perhaps the most disturbing part of these stories isn't the moment when the ghost appears or when the passenger vanishes. It's what comes after, the way the road feels different, the way the night seems to breathe differently. It's the fear that the next knock on the window, the next raised hand at the curb, won't be someone alive. One of the most unsettling experiences comes from a driver named Tomas, who worked the late shift in Oaxaca. Tomas always believed his ancestors watched over him. He carried a small charm blessed by a priest, a habit his grandmother had insisted on. That charm gave him comfort for years, until one particular night when it seemed useless against what he encountered. He had been driving along a rural road, the kind where no streetlights exist and the darkness feels endless. Out of nowhere, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slowed, thinking it was a drunk villager or someone stranded. But as his headlights illuminated the figure, his body froze. It was a woman in black, her face hidden beneath a veil. She didn't move, didn't signal, just stood silently. Against his instincts, Tomas stopped. The woman walked slowly to the car and opened the back door without a word. She sat down, her veil still covering her features. Tomas asked where she needed to go, but her voice was barely more than a whisper, and he couldn't make out the words. Still, he started driving, trying to follow her gestures. Minutes turned into half an hour. They drove deeper into the countryside, further from the city. Tomas's nerves grew sharper with every mile. Finally, they reached a small bridge over a dry riverbed. The woman tapped the seat, signaling him to stop. He turned around to ask if this was really her destination. The back seat was empty. His heart stopped. He swore he felt her presence just seconds before. Panicking, he pressed his foot on the gas and sped away. Yet in his mirror, he caught a final glimpse. Her figure, standing once again in the middle of the bridge, veil covering her face, watching him disappear into the night. Stories like Tomas's are not rare. The woman in black or the woman in white are recurring figures in countless accounts from drivers across Mexico. They appear, ask for rides, and vanish, leaving only dread behind. Some believe they are souls trapped between worlds. Others whisper that they are omens, heralds of death. But not all encounters involve passengers who enter the car. Sometimes, the terror comes from the road itself. A driver named Sergio, who worked in Chiapas, shared an experience that still makes his voice shake when he recalls it. Sergio was heading back to town late at night, his taxi empty after dropping off his last passenger. The road was deserted, lined with thick forest on both sides. Suddenly, his headlights picked up movement ahead. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as he got closer, he realized it was a child. A small boy, barefoot, standing alone in the middle of the road. Sergio slowed down, confused. What was a child doing out there, so far from any houses? He stopped the car, rolled down the window, and called out. The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, staring blankly. Concern overcame Sergio's fear. He stepped out of the car and approached slowly. But when he was only a few feet away, the boy turned his head sharply, his eyes completely black. Sergio stumbled back, horrified. The child opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, Sergio heard whispers, dozens of voices, overlapping, echoing inside his head. He ran back into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped away, his hands trembling so badly he could barely keep control of the wheel. In the mirror, he saw the boy still standing there, his black eyes glinting in the darkness. Sergio never took that route again. And whenever he hears stories of the Niños de la Carretera, the ghostly children of the road, he stays silent, unwilling to relive what he saw. Perhaps the most terrifying stories are the ones that blur the line between dream and reality. A driver named Felipe shared one such tale. Felipe had been driving in Mexico City during one of the hottest summers in memory. Exhausted, he often struggled to stay awake. One night, as he waited for passengers, he felt his eyelids growing heavy. He shook his head, trying to fight sleep. That's when someone tapped on his window. It was a man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured. He asked for a ride to a neighborhood Felipe knew well. Relieved for the distraction, Felipe agreed. The man climbed into the back seat silent. As they drove, Felipe tried to start a conversation, but the passenger gave no response, only silence. After a while, Felipe realized something disturbing. The man's reflection wasn't in the rearview mirror. The seat was visible, but not the passenger. His stomach turned. He gripped the wheel tighter, sweat dripping down his forehead. He wanted to stop, to throw the man out, but fear held him still. Finally, when they reached the address, Felipe turned to tell the man they had arrived. But the seat was empty. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car move. Nothing. He sat frozen for minutes, too afraid to move. Later, when he recounted the story to other drivers, one of them warned him, "Be careful. Sometimes the dead ride with us when we're too tired. They slip in, quiet, like dreams." Felipe never worked long shifts again. These stories, scattered across cities and highways, share a chilling truth. The roads of Mexico are not only traveled by the living. Taxi drivers, men and women who spend countless nights behind the wheel, bear witness to things most of us will never see. They carry the weight of vanished passengers, of voices that whisper from the shadows, of eyes that stare through the rearview mirror. And perhaps that is the true horror of these tales, not the ghosts themselves, but the thought that anyone, at any moment, could step into a taxi and find themselves face to face with something that does not belong to this world. The city lights, the laughter of bars, the noise of traffic, none of it protects against the silence that settles when the dead decide to take a ride. The next time you step into a taxi late at night, remember these stories. Remember the drivers who have seen too much, who have carried more than just passengers. And as you sit in the back seat, glancing at the mirror, ask yourself one question. What if, just for a moment, your reflection isn't the only one looking back?